Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for tuning in to this fourth instalment of the series called Innovation Conversations. These conversations are celebrating the Vice-Chancellor's Innovation Awards for this year at the University of Oxford. My name is Alex Mullen. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Nottingham and Fellow at All Souls College. And I'm currently PI, Principal Investigator of the European Research Council funded project Latin Now. I am, like Professor Jonathan Prag, an ancient historian, and I use sociolinguistics, archaeology, and epigraphy to try to understand more about life in the Roman provinces. Now, if you're wondering what epigraphy is, fear not, all will be revealed shortly, I hope. So today it's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathan Prag, who is Professor of Ancient History in the Faculty of Classics at the University of Oxford. And Jonathan is winner in the Building Capacity category of this year's Innovation Awards. These awards, he's been awarded it for the series of collaborations that he's been developing in studying and making more accessible the wealth of surviving inscribed texts from ancient Sicily. These innovation awards celebrate the quality and breadth of research-led innovation in the University of Oxford, and in particular, the kind of innovations that are having societal and/or economic impact. Professor Prag's ongoing work in Sicily, which is collaborating with schools, museums, other stakeholders, and of course other researchers in both the study and the presentation of ancient documents, is a brilliant example of how academic research can create societal impact. And I think it really demonstrates the transformative power of the appreciation of cultural heritage. Now, there will be an opportunity to ask Professor Prag questions about his project and his ongoing work through me, either via the chat window in YouTube or via the university's Twitter feed. And I'll try to deal with these questions as they are coming in. But before that, I'm going to hand over to Professor Prag, who's going to give a brief presentation of the work on ancient Sicily, which led to the receipt of this important award. Thank you very much, Professor Prag. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for giving me this opportunity to present this project, which it deserves to be said right from the beginning is very much a collaborative project. And so what I'm presenting is a huge amount of work done by other people in which I have very often played little more than the part of facilitator. I should begin, I suppose, by explaining what epigraphy might be, what inscriptions are. Epigraphy is a word that ancient historians tend to bandy around very readily and quickly, but it's somewhat opaque to those who don't work in the discipline. Very simply, epigraphy is the study of texts written on more or less durable materials. The word comes from the ancient Greek, meaning to write upon something. Epigraphy as a practice is perfectly familiar to us today, perhaps most obviously in the context of funerary inscriptions, tombstones, which is still widely used, but in memorials as well and other public contexts in particular. In the ancient world, however, it was far more frequent and common as a practice, far more widespread. Monumental inscriptions on stone, funerary inscriptions on stone, but also on many other types of object, on metal, on pottery. Perhaps useful to think of the parallel of just the extent of signage, labeling, printing on hard materials in the modern world. But as such, it provides an invaluable source of evidence from the time itself, contemporary evidence for historical events, for social life and customs and culture, for economic history, and indeed linguistic history, for which it's absolutely fundamental. In the case of ancient Sicily, where I work, this is a particularly valuable source of evidence. Attempts to collect this material and to gather it together for study go back some 400 years, in the first instance to a corpus collected by a German scholar, Georg Gualtherus, in 1624. The collection of such material has always been the domain of antiquarians and increasingly highly scholarly specialized discipline, with, particularly in the 19th century, the attempts to collect all of the material and gather it together into massive, very erudite volumes, where, if you look at the example on the screen, the inscription in ancient Greek is in turn served with a very short commentary or set of annotations, all in Latin. And in volumes which, as you can see from the picture on the screen, are enormous in size and only accessible, therefore, in libraries and to those versed in both the ancient languages. Extremely, therefore, difficult of access to any other than those who've spent extended periods studying the languages and the subject. What those ancient collections also bring out is one of the other challenges, which is that between the time of Gualtherus in 1624, who recorded approximately 350 inscriptions, and the present day, when we have already recorded in excess of 3,500 inscriptions from the island just on stone, the volume of material, as you can see, has increased at least tenfold, and quite possibly, well, certainly more. And gathering that material together becomes an immense challenge. The last time there was any attempt to comprehensively collect the material was in the 1880s and 1890s, and that was before the birth of modern archaeology, after which the material available more than doubled. There is therefore a great challenge, on the one hand, to gather them all together for the purposes of actually studying ancient culture and society on the island, as elsewhere in the ancient Mediterranean, but also to do this without making them even less accessible to the wider public and anyone with an interest in this material. So both to collect them and to make them more accessible. This can most obviously now be done with the increasing potential of digital tools and resources, both in terms of the analytical power that a digital collection, a database provides, but also in terms of the straightforward means of accessibility, presenting them as in the I.Sicily Inscriptions of Sicily project, which began several years ago, through an online, freely accessible digital corpus. This method of presenting the material digitally is made possible by increasing developments in the digital humanities with digital tools and methods, in particular a system called the Text Encoding Initiative, which was developed for digitizing manuscripts originally, but which can be adapted very readily for inscribed objects of all types, and a subset of which is known as Epidoc, widely developed within the academic community for encoding inscriptions, and a small example provided on the screen. Now, obviously, an encoded inscription in itself is not necessarily any more accessible than an inscription with a commentary in Latin, but the point of an encoded inscription is that it is then machine readable, and it is possible to then readily represent it through a website and other tools so that it is extremely accessible. The digital tools exist, however, the practicalities nonetheless of gathering all the material remain immense. Some thousands of texts are scattered across the island, some of them still in situ in obscure locations, many of them in museum stores, often where they have been for, in some cases, more than 100 years, and they're often large objects, they're difficult to display, they're difficult to store, and so they present huge challenges for the museums, and then in turn for those who want to actually access them or study them. The material is primarily in museums, and the first step therefore becomes that of identifying all of the museums. So an early part of the I.Sicily project involved actually gathering together a database essentially of existing collections, which there are some 150 on the island. But doing so then enabled us to provide directly a tool to the museums, which was to create their own individual online catalogues through the overall project, which in turn facilitates direct collaboration and makes the project of immediate value to those museums, which did not themselves necessarily have the resources to put their collections online, either to study them or to make them accessible. what I would like briefly to illustrate, and what underpins, I think, the giving of this award by the university, by the Vice-Chancellor, is a collaborative project which developed with the specific case of the Civic Museum in the city of Catania in eastern Sicily. The Civic Museum, as you can see, is housed in the old Norman castle of the city, the heart of the city, and contains some 500 inscriptions on stone, a very substantial collection, about half of them from the island and about half originally from the city of Rome. And in 2016, we developed a collaboration, partly at the inspiration of some of the Sicilian partners, between multiple different groups, the I.Sicily project itself and the museum, but also then the Institute of Cognitive Sciences and Technologies, sponsored by the Italian Research Council, its branch in Catania, and with a state school, an artistic state school in the city of some 1,500 pupils, the Liceo Artistico Statale Mimit Lazzaro. And what began in turn as, and I should add, in the case of the I.Sicily project, with significant support in turn from the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities in a knowledge exchange fellowship, the value of which I'll come back to in a moment. Now, this began as, in a sense, a straightforward outreach project on a very typical basis, with visits to the school, presenting inscriptions, the history of Catania, and exploring the background. But it very rapidly developed from there through the possibilities created primarily by the Italian Ministry of Education's Alternanza Scuola Lavoro program, which is a form of work experience program for schools, in which the school students rapidly progressed to actually working hands-on in the museum, first locating and identifying the inscriptions, often in the basement stalls of the museum, as you can see here, and from there cataloguing and actually recording the individual inscriptions and photographing them. And finally, as the final step in that, and this was where the Knowledge Exchange Fellowship and the funding from Torch became invaluable, in the design and actual realization of a permanent 3-room exhibition in the museum of a selection of 35 of the most significant of the inscriptions, entirely designed by the students, but made possible to actually physically realize through the financial support of Torch. And the first significant exhibition of its sort in the museum since the original creation of the Civic Museum in the first part of the 20th century, and the displays which had dated back to that point, and which had in turn been taken down in the later 20th century. It's worth emphasizing within this the significance of the material, in that half of the material in the museum was local material, and therefore what these school students from Catania were actually working on was material that related directly back to the history of the city, to their forebears in the city, whether that was funerary inscriptions for instance, this 13-year-old girl in Catania who died and whose parents set it up on her behalf, or inscriptions such as this part Hebrew, part Latin inscription, a very significant monument to the early Jewish community in Catania and the diverse communities present in Catania in antiquity, just as in modernity, or inscriptions recording the actual physical building work going on in the city, the remains of which surround anyone who lives in the city today. This particular one relating to the city baths, the text is some 4 meters long from the architraves. The baths are now visible in part underneath the modern Duomo cathedral and the cathedral square in the city. Having undertaken this core initial project, the school, the students were very quick to then disseminate their activity, to present it to others. So other schools, other students were taken around the exhibition, had the process of developing the exhibition explained to them and its study. The exhibition itself, through the Institute of Cognitive and Technical Sciences, was also transformed into a virtual exhibition, and so is also available independent of the I.Sicily project as its own website. And those presentations in turn, if you like, inspired imitations elsewhere. And we participated in a similar set of slightly smaller scale projects, for example, at the Archaeological Museum in Syracuse in the following year, where students again worked in the stores, worked with specific material, and developed small exhibitions temporarily open to the public. In the case of Catania, the project continues and is ongoing and has seen various expansions and developments. I think a clear sign of its success and its appeal to the students. The school itself, which is an art school, not, for instance, Liceo Classico, has subsequently introduced and offered Latin classes. And in the first year, more than 100 students signed up to study Latin in a school which had never previously offered such things. And they are now currently working on a new project based in the ancient Roman theatre of the city, working with both the epigraphic and architectural material recovered in the excavations in the theatre. The I.Sicily project itself is similarly expanding and developing off the back of much of this work, and what has been made possible by increasing the speed, the access, the opening up of the material, the recording of the material, and this has been a major contributory factor in the success of, in turn, winning an ERC Advanced grant under the title of Crossreads, which aims to take the I.Sicily project and develop it in multiple directions, exploring in much greater detail the linguistics, the petrology of the inscriptions, the paleography, the letter forms of the inscriptions, and bringing all of these different elements together in a comprehensive study of all of the epigraphic material of the island in order to cast new light on the social and cultural history of the island. And any project of that scale simply cannot take place without the collaboration of many, many individuals on the ground, on the island, in the many different museums, and with the participation and, if you like, the education, straightforwardly, of those whose culture, whose ancient history it actually is. And it's hugely exciting not only to have done that already over the previous years, but to be able to look forward to doing more of the same for the next 5 years. And it only really remains to say thank you to the huge range of people, technical and scientific, archaeological, historical, who have all worked on this, both in Oxford and in Sicily. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Prag, for that overview demonstrating the richness of this material from ancient Sicily and the innovative ways in which you've been able to harness it not only for research, but also for societal impact. So we have some questions coming through. Please do submit more as we carry on with this conversation, and I'll try to get through as many as possible. Before I turn to the questions that are coming through and get into some of the more interesting detail, I wonder if you could just tell us about this Building Capacity Award. What does building capacity really mean, and why is it that you think that your project was singled out for having a lot of that?
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for the very generous introduction as well. I think, in my own mind at least, building capacity has two aspects to it. One of them is a more selfish one, and I don't think is necessarily quite so innovative. And the other is epitomized most directly in the project that led to the exhibition itself. So on the one hand, there's a very straightforward problem which has confronted for example, humanities scholars for a very long time, which is if you want to put this sort of collection of material together, it just requires an awful lot of work. And the tradition in this field has been of effectively the lone scholar, perhaps corresponding with other scholars, and so on, spending decades often putting together something of this sort, very often not even managing to finish as a result. It's a lifetime project.
Yeah.
And as the amount of material increases and as the diversity of the material increases, and in somewhere like Sicily, where it's across several different languages as well, it starts to exceed any one individual's actual technical capacities. as well. My knowledge of Sickle or Elimian or Punic is really rather limited compared to my knowledge of Greek or Latin and so on. So doing it by oneself is already implausible. So there is a need from the project's perspective simply to expand the project's capacity. Now, at one level, that's simply therefore about collaborating, but therefore it's about finding ways to collaborate and productive and powerful ways to collaborate. And some of that comes out of the sorts of possibilities that digital approaches make available. As we're all experiencing now, there's an awful lot of potential for interacting, collaborating online and digitally. And if you're actually building the corpus in a digital format, that becomes that much easier. But what then the inspiration was to try and empower as many people as possible locally in the individual museums and those who might work in the museums to find ways to do that. The Catania example, I think, really showed how this could work in all sorts of ways. But in many respects, I was acting very much as the catalyst and the facilitator rather than, in a sense, even leading. There were people there who could do these, whether it was the teachers at the school, the staff at the museum, who all individually had the skills and the ability to do these things, but it was actually being able to bring it all together with some of the necessary underlying and broader contextual and technical knowledge to actually make this possible. And I think the final aspect one would then add in is that it's not only increased the capacity for bringing material into the project and increased the local capacity for exploring that material and engaging with that material, but there's then been that knock-on effect of, as it were, imitation and facilitation of imitation elsewhere, so that it's increased the local and island-wide capacity as well. So it's kind of in three different directions.
You become a model for how to do this. In fact, there's some comments saying, this is inspiring work. And people working on more recent historical material are sort of learning some tips and so on from your work, which is great. On the subject of getting people involved, we have a question about just how many school children have been involved to date in the project. Do you have a figure?
I don't have a total figure in the Catania project itself that generated the exhibition and worked in the Civic Museum. That involved approximately 120 school children. It's a large school. It involved multiple groups across 2 different year cohorts, and that is now scaling up. So the equivalent projects at Syracuse involved at least 3, if not 5 different schools with classes out of each of those. And we've carried on with subsequent cohorts at Catania. So I guess the total number pushes up towards the 400 or 500 mark by now.
So we have a question about getting all these people involved, a question about crowdsourcing and kind of these big collaborative projects. Someone wants to know how you error correct in this kind of setup, and I think so. One thing that came out in your presentation is that as a result of what you were doing, people started learning Latin, but that means that they probably didn't have any of the languages, potentially, probably not Greek either, that might have been present on some of these inscriptions. So how do you cope with a wide group of people, some of whom won't know any of the languages that they're treating, and how do you go about sort of error correcting, as this questioner is asking?
It's a great question. There are a number of different aspects to it, and crowdsourcing on this sort of potentially highly specialized set of material obviously has some degrees of limitation, and part of this is controlled by, in a sense, selectively crowdsourcing. So it's working with as it were, prearranged groups. There was a particular challenge that made this very obvious, in a sense, with the Catania project, where it was a liceo artistico, not a liceo classico as they have in the Italian system. So these students were not learning, didn't have the opportunity to learn Greek or Latin. In fact, in many respects, because what we're doing is not simply about the text on the inscription, but is about the object as a whole, the inscribed object, and therefore the object as a whole needs recording and cataloguing. Not having the language, but having a good ability at observation and good observation skills, in fact, is more important in many respects. So a lot of what they were doing didn't require understanding the text. And in fact, I mean, you may have encountered this yourself. If you don't understand a text, but you actually potentially transcribe a text more accurately than if you try to fill in the gaps when you think you know what it means, and so on. So ultimately, there is one significant resource limitation in all of this, which is, yes, these things still have to be checked and edited at the end of the process, and so there tends to be there's a funneling effect, and a backlog develops at that final stage, and some of that is visible in the fact that the online version of the exhibition is still a work in progress, effectively, because that involves the finalized versions of the individual editions. Some of it was, in the case of the Catania project, again, the teachers themselves provided a significant degree of, if you like, that error checking. I think it has to be stressed throughout this whole process that actually the Catania project in particular would not have happened without the phenomenal amount of input of the individual school teachers, many of whom were actually highly trained with university degrees in fact, classical archaeology and related disciplines and so on. And so they were actually quite strong in the material. But the amount of time and energy put in by the teachers themselves was absolutely crucial.
So we did touch on languages then in that sort of last exchange, and you mentioned two of the languages that I'm about to ask you about, but I spotted them beforehand in the new logo for your project, which is starting this month, I think, is it? The European Research Council funded project Crossreads. Your logo for that is a crossword, and the answers are some of the languages that we can find in ancient Sicily. So I don't know how many people, the eagle-eyed amongst you, were spotting these as well, but there was Latin and Greek, Punic and Hebrew, most of which many of us will have come across in some way, shape or form at some point, perhaps. Oscan, perhaps classicists will know about that, Italic language, but then there are two that even some classicists might not be very up on, Elymian and Sickle. Can you tell us about these things, please?
Sure. So Sickle and Elymian are both native Sicilian languages, insofar as one can talk about native languages. They were there seemingly spoken by the people before Greeks or Phoenicians settled on the island in the 8th and 7th centuries BC. And the evidence for those languages is entirely and only epigraphic. So this sort of project is engaging directly with the only available evidence for those languages. But that evidence is extremely difficult and extremely limited. They seem to use the Greek alphabet, so they're learning the Greek alphabet from the incoming population, but they're then inscribing short texts, mostly on fragments of pottery that are often pots engraved with, as it were, "This belongs to me" kind of texts. I am the pot of Tisseros, for example. And the evidence is so limited that even the question of which language family these languages belong to is far from certain. And even the question of whether they are separate languages or just slightly divergent branches of the same language is also uncertain. But nobody's ever brought all of this material together in one place either. So another ambition of this project and going on into the Crossreads project is precisely to try to pull these different, very poorly attested languages together, since they all come from the same place. And are engaging directly with each other.
So there's we're running out of time now. There's a couple of questions about technologies and the kind of tools we can use. So perhaps our sort of last question, we could end on some kind of innovative technologies. So you mentioned yourself that in the presentation about the kind of text encoded initiative thing that we use, which we call Epidoc for epigraphy, and that's clearly important for machine reading and searching and indexing and so on. Is what we like to use to do digital epigraphy. But there are other things, right? There are other digital techniques that we can use, and I'm wondering about something like RTI, reflectance transformation imaging. Could you talk about whether you've been using other techniques like that to read the texts more accurately and to also produce digital versions of them that will preserve them in some sense and allow them to be accessible across the world.
We've done it to a relatively limited degree now, in that the focus has primarily been on getting just good quality standard imagery of most of the text, because that was not existing at the start. Something like RTI, which allows you to alter the light source through the use of multiple images through an algorithm and so on, is extremely powerful, but is very resource heavy. And so there's a very limited number of texts it really makes sense to try and apply it to. What we did start to do in the context of the Catania exhibition, and there's a collaboration I would really like to explore in the future as the technology becomes ever more easily accessible, indeed can be done with the mobile phone now, is the development of 3D photogrammetric imagery, which can in turn then be mounted and accessed, which means that, even more relevant in the current situation where it's harder to travel and so on, you can actually, for yourself, manipulate the object in 3D in real time. But which also facilitates reading, because if it's done at sufficient resolution, it gives you photogrammetric, what's the word, I've forgotten now, but levels of the surface itself. So we're certainly looking at that, and it looks like another opportunity for collaboration again.
Absolutely. Well, there are still lots more questions coming in, but I think we must unfortunately conclude this webinar. I'd like to thank Professor Prag very much for showing us something of what went into winning this award, and to thank him very much for taking the time to talk to us this afternoon. Please look up his new project, Crossreads, and do look out for the next innovation conversation, which will be, I think, at the same time next week. But for now, from Professor Prag and I, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.